The storm had not yet touched the valley when the accusation arrived, yet the air already carried the weight of something darker than weather. Long before the first drop of rain hit the cracked soil, whispers had begun drifting across the community, quiet at first, then sharpened by suspicion, twisted by prejudice, and carried like debris along a rising current of blame. A massive flood was coming, they said. A catastrophe waiting to happen. And somehow, without logic or evidence, every accusing finger pointed toward one person living near the river's edge. The community had always treated the river like a boundary between wealth and labor, entitlement and humility, privilege and survival. Those who lived upstream embraced it as decoration, a peaceful backdrop for morning runs and decorative bridges. Those who lived downstream understood its real force. They knew how it carved earth, destroyed barriers, and ignored property lines. But the accusations never followed facts. They followed fear, and behind that, something more poisonous. When the clouds finally gathered like bruises across the sky, the neighborhood board seized the moment. A claim emerged that a hidden obstruction had been placed in the river path. Something that would push water back into the community. Something that would destroy homes. Something that only one person, someone already treated as an outsider, could possibly be responsible for. The narrative tightened like a storm front pulling itself together. And once the story formed, it didn't matter that the river didn't belong to them at all. It didn't matter that natural waterways ignored man-made borders. It didn't matter that nothing had been touched. The community needed someone to blame. Someone they were comfortable blaming. By dusk, the sky dimmed into a colorless haze, and the board prepared legal action so large and outrageous it felt unreal, an accusation worth nearly $3 million. An accusation based entirely on assumptions wrapped in prejudice and delivered without hesitation. Papers were filed. Neighbors murmured. The board celebrated a victory they had not earned. And the storm had not even begun. As thunder rolled in the distance, a kind of cinematic dread rose through the valley, as if nature itself had grown tired of being misinterpreted. The wind pushed against half-built fences, tore through brittle leaves, and carried with it the sense that something monumental was approaching, something more destructive than the coming flood. A reckoning of truth. A conflict long overdue. When the rain finally started, it wasn't gentle. It pounded rooftops, clawed at windows, and carved straight lines across the dirt like nature was erasing lies with every drop. The river swelled in minutes, rising with an ancient fury that no community board could control, no accusation could tame, and no lawsuit could rewrite. The flood came exactly as predicted, but not for the reasons they claimed. Not from sabotage. Not from mismanagement. Not from any person at all. Yet when the water began to surge toward the community's pristine lawns and manicured walkways, the board refused to face the truth. They clung harder to their story, insisting that someone else, someone beneath them, had created the disaster now unfolding. They didn't know this storm would reveal everything they had tried to hide. The lies, the prejudice, the corruption, and the truth about who really controlled the land and the water they pretended to own. The flood was coming. So was justice. And the storm would wash more than mud across their streets. Hit subscribe. Watch till the end. The valley did not earn its peace, it borrowed it. Every quiet morning, every still afternoon, every calm night felt like a temporary truce between nature and the people who tried to control it. The river cut through the land long before any neighborhood existed, long before fences, walkways, meeting halls, or the polished gates that marked who belonged and who merely lived nearby. Yet those who held power treated the land as if ownership were a birthright rather than a responsibility. The outsider lived in a small house perched close enough to the river to hear its shifting moods. Not wealthy, not influential, not welcomed by the homeowner's board that maintained its fragile authority with the precision of a judge and the pettiness of a child. The house was old, worn, and honest, unlike the manicured homes that lined the other side of the valley. It stood on land inherited, guarded, and understood through generations. A land shaped not by money but by history, patience, and a deep respect for the earth beneath it. Suspicion had always lingered around that small corner of the valley. Not because of anything done, but simply because of who lived there. The board disguised their unease with formalities, letters, inspections, unnecessary notices, but the truth seeped through. They looked at the outsider as someone out of place in a world designed for people who looked different, spoke differently, lived differently. Racism rarely announced itself openly. It preferred to drift through assumptions, buried judgments, and unspoken lines drawn across property maps. As rain clouds gathered over the distant mountains, the board grew restless. Their latest project, an expensive landscaping redesign along the river path, had consumed funds they couldn't explain. Meetings grew tense. Questions were avoided. Documents were hidden. And when early predictions warned of unusually heavy rainfall, fear mixed quickly with opportunity. The outsider became the perfect target. Rumors spread that debris near the old property restricted the river's flow. That changes to the land upstream could push water back toward the community. That someone had tampered with the natural path. No evidence existed, but that didn't matter. The board needed a scapegoat before anyone examined their own failings: missing permits, ignored environmental warnings, and unapproved construction dangerously close to the waterline. The storm grew slowly, but the tension grew faster. And long before the first drop of rain touched the valley, the board had already decided who would bear the blame. The rain did not arrive all at once. It crept into the valley like a whisper, soft at first, too soft to justify the fear that had already settled across the board members' manicured neighborhood. Yet tension rose with every shift in the wind. The outsiders sensed it long before the storm built its strength, not the weather, but the way the community moved around them. The glances lasted longer. The silence stretched further. The boundary lines, invisible yet fiercely guarded, tightened like a noose around the old river house. The board had been busy in the weeks leading up to the storm. They walked the riverbanks with clipboards and self-importance, measuring distances, inspecting soil, pointing at the old property as if marking the location of an inevitable disaster. Their steps echoed entitlement. Their presence carried accusation. And yet the river itself remained unchanged, running steadily just as it had through countless seasons, storms, and histories that preceded them all. But fear is a powerful sculptor of false realities. And racism, quiet, subtle, and socially disguised, became the tool they used to carve the outsider into the villain they needed. Upstream, the community had commissioned a renovation project the previous year, a series of decorative stone walls and widened trails. It was marketed as beautification, a way to elevate property value. But the builders had cut too deeply into the river's natural embankment, altering its course just enough to create instability. The board ignored the warnings. The contractors, pressured to finish quickly, left structural flaws behind. And when small signs of erosion appeared, the board dismissed them, burying any evidence under polished stones and expensive landscaping. The outsider knew nothing of this. Their life revolved around simplicity, maintaining the old house, tending to the land, respecting the river as a living force rather than a decorative feature. Generations before had taught that the river gave warnings before it unleashed itself. And in recent days, it had grown restless. Its currents carried a strange turbulence, a strange vibration that pulsed through the soil. Birds that typically nested along the waterline had flown further inland, unsettled by something humans refused to see. But the board did not listen to the river. They listened to their fears. And as the storm predicted by meteorologists grew, so did their desperation to secure a narrative that protected them from blame. The outsider became the answer to their problems long before the storm truly began. On the morning the lawsuit was filed, the valley was wrapped in an eerie stillness. The clouds hung low, like heavy curtains preparing to conceal a tragedy. The outsider noticed them from the porch, the strange colors swirling in the sky, the unnatural quietness of the wind, the way the air felt too thick, too heavy, too expectant. Something monumental was building, and nature felt poised on the edge of release. Meanwhile, the board gathered in their meeting hall, a pristine building symbolizing their curated authority. Papers were stacked neatly, accusations typed with confidence, and their signatures inked without hesitation. The figures were outrageous, millions in damages attributed to a flood that hadn't yet happened, tied to actions that had never occurred. The lawsuit claimed obstruction, negligence, irresponsible land alteration. They framed the outsider as a danger, a threat, a burden on the community. They chose the target they always found easiest to blame. As the storm clouds grew darker, neighbors whispered along sidewalks and driveways. Misinformation spread through biased assumptions, shallow judgments, and the quiet prejudice woven into the fabric of the valley. Years of unspoken biases erupted into certainty that the outsider was responsible for a disaster no one had seen, no one had proven, no one had caused. When the first thunder rumbled across the valley, the outsider felt the earth tremble. Not just with nature's warning, but with the weight of the storm forming in human hearts. Something told them that the coming days would unravel truths that had been buried too long. And something else, something instinctive, warned that surviving the storm would require more strength than the river alone demanded. By evening, the storm touched down in full. Rain slashed across rooftops, hammered against windows, and transformed the valley into a battleground between land and sky. The river swelled quickly, fueled by relentless rain pouring from a sky that seemed determined to test the valley's integrity. The outsider prepared for it the way their ancestors once had, securing the house, reinforcing old barriers, listening to the river's shifting cries. Upstream, the water slammed into the decorative stone barriers built by the board. The walls, weakened by erosion and poor construction, began to buckle under the force. Cracks formed. Mud loosened. Stones shifted. The beautiful renovations that cost thousands now threatened to become the valley's undoing. But the board remained blind. In their minds, the narrative was already complete. They imagined the water pooling, redirecting, and gathering near the outsider's property before bending back toward their neighborhood, a neat little story where nature obeyed their prejudice theories. They never expected the river to expose the truth. As night deepened, the river snapped one of the stone walls open like a fault line. Water surged through the breach with a roar, carrying mud, rocks, and debris down the valley. But instead of heading toward the outsider's land, the floodwater twisted back into the community's newly widened walking paths. The altered landscape funneled water directly into the neighborhood's pristine streets, just as environmental warnings had predicted long ago. The board had created their own destruction, and they had blamed someone else before nature could prove it. But the truth would not reveal itself quietly. The storm intensified. The river grew angrier. The valley's history rumbled beneath the surface. And in the midst of chaos, the outsider watched from a distance, aware that what was unfolding would expose not just corruption or negligence, but the deep-rooted prejudice that had driven the blame toward them. The storm was far from over, and the rising floodwaters were only the beginning of what the valley was about to learn. The storm reached its breaking point in a single violent moment, an eruption of nature that tore through the valley with the force of truth itself. The river, swollen beyond anything in recent memory, rose with a fury shaped by years of mistreatment and weeks of ignorance. The water no longer flowed, it lunged, twisting through the altered landscape like a creature suddenly released from chains. Upstream, the final stone barrier collapsed under the relentless pressure. It shattered with a sound that seemed to silence the storm for a heartbeat, a deep, echoing crack that signaled the collapse not only of a structure, but of the lies that had built it. The surge that followed was unstoppable. It rolled through the manicured trails, tore up decorative stones, ripped through gardens, and carved through the heart of the community that believed it could control a river older than their maps. The outsider watched from higher ground as the truth unfolded in real time. The water bypassed the old house entirely, flowing toward the community center where the board had gathered in a panic. Their immaculate walkways funneled the flood straight toward their own foundations. Panic spread in their eyes, but the river cared nothing for their fear or their authority. Nature exposed every hidden flaw, every unapproved excavation, every ignored warning, every shortcut taken in the name of aesthetics and convenience. The destruction was swift, merciless, and precise, as if the storm itself had chosen to reveal the truth with undeniable clarity. By the time the surge slowed, the valley stood divided not by property lines, but by truth. The outsider remained untouched, their lands steady beneath them. The community, once so confident in its accusations, was left drowning in the consequences of its own actions. And in that moment, Amid the ruins and the rising silence, the valley finally saw who truly held the blame. When the storm finally withdrew, it left behind more than wreckage. It revealed a truth no one could bury. The sun rose slowly over the valley, casting light across the destruction with an almost deliberate gentleness, as if granting the community one quiet moment to face what they had refused to see. Streets that once gleamed with polished order lay torn and carved open by the redirected water. Gardens once displayed with pride had been swept into tangled heaps. The meeting hall, where signatures had been confidently penned against the outsider, stood cracked at its foundation. Yet high on the untouched slope, the outsider's land remained steady, marked only by the resilience passed down through generations that respected the river instead of reshaping it. Officials arrived. Inspectors followed. Experts walked the valley with heavy steps and heavier expressions. Their findings unfolded with a clarity that shattered the carefully crafted accusations. The flood had not begun near the outsider's property. It had erupted from the upstream modifications. Every unauthorized trench, every unstable stone wall, every attempt to beautify what was never broken. The board's negligence was undeniable. Their blame had been deliberate. The lawsuit collapsed under the weight of evidence. What began as a $2.8 million accusation transformed into a case of misconduct, cover-ups, and racially motivated targeting. The narrative the board had weaponized now stood against them. Their power fractured, their reputations washed away just as swiftly as the stones they had forced into the river's path. But true impact did not lie in legal rulings. It lived in the quiet shift of awareness within the valley. Residents began to understand the prejudice they had accepted, the assumptions they had believed, the ease with which they had allowed one person to become the target of their fears.